Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 climactic board games. You heard right. Climactic board games. That is the opposite of anticlimactic. These are board games that rev up and give you their very best at the very end of the game. These are games that typically finish very, very well. And at the end of the game, you feel the competitiveness. You feel the tightness of the game. It feels close, and you're excited and intrigued and interested in seeing what the outcome is and who's going to be the winner of those games. So, without any further ado, let's move straight to my number 10. My number 10 climactic board game is Colosseum, designed by Wolfgang Kramer and Marcus Lupke, and this edition here republished by Tasty Minstrel Games. And in this game, players are running their own Colosseum. This is a game for 3 to 5 players, and players are running their own Colosseum based on ancient Roman times, and they're trying to accrue all these different resources that represent their actors and their props and their animals that they're going to need in order to carry out their different events or their different stories and plays. And in order to do so, they're going to partake in different auctions and even a trading round each round in order to acquire and accrue these different resources. And throughout the game, you have all these different events or plays that you're trying to accomplish and map out which ones you want to get. And they're all based on real tragedies and comedies based on ancient Roman literature and theater. And basically players are trying to accrue a particular configuration of all these tiles, and you're looking at this player aid that lets you know all the different events that will be available for you later on in the game. So early on in the game, you're just kind of putting on basic meager performances in order to score some money and use it to acquire more resources and prepare yourself for that last performance, that 5th performance, because in this game scoring is not cumulative. Your score is based on the round in which you score the highest, and you ideally want that to be the 5th round because that gives you the best chance of winning the game. And it is so cool because although quite often you will find 1 or maybe even 2 players that are lagging behind and have no chance of winning, there's always 2, sometimes 3 players that are really going toe-to-toe. And although you might think that one player clearly has the edge, by the 5th and final round, that player is overtaken by one of those other competitors, because that's how interesting the end of the game is. And it's so fulfilling, especially because when you made it to that 5th round, you were mapping that out probably as early as the 2nd round, as you were accruing all these different resources and looking at your player aid and trying to hopefully plan so you can purchase that event and pull it out and get as many spectators to watch it as possible. Really cool, really exciting, at least for those 2 or 3 players that have a chance at the end of the game. My number 10 climactic board game, Colosseum. And now we move on to my number 9, and my number 9 is Alhambra by Durkan and Queen Games. Spiel des Jahres winner for 2003, and this is a tile laying game where players are accruing these different tiles and placing them, and there is a certain importance to the way you place them because they have walls, and walls cannot be adjacent to non-wall borders, so that's something you have to factor in. But there's 6 different colors that players are trying to acquire the different tiles in. And the different colors have different values. And there's basically a stock market of sorts taking place because there's 3 scoring rounds. And at the end of each scoring round, players are going to score based on their majorities in each of these 6 different colors. And again, they all score differently. Now, what's interesting about this game and what makes this climactic, especially if you're playing with higher player counts, you probably don't want to play with 5 or 6 players, but if you're playing with 4 players, this could be very exciting at the end, is because at the end of the first scoring round, players only score for the colors in which they have the majority in. But in the 2nd round, they score for the colors they had the majority in and the secondary in, and they're scoring more points than they did in the 1st round. And then by the 3rd round, not only are you scoring for your primary, your secondary, but you're also scoring for all of the colors in which you have the tertiary, the 3rd highest amount. And you're scoring so much more points by the 3rd round. So this makes it exciting because even if you are last place, theoretically, if you have a good enough 3rd round, you can win this game. So this is one of those games that you cannot fall asleep on, people. So although you might feel a little bit bored early on, or a little bit not into it, or you're not threatening other players, keep focused, because again, if you have a really positive and strong third round, you can absolutely win this game. And again, it creates that climax, because even the players who are in the lead want to remain focused and engaged with the game. They do not want to make silly decisions that grant opportunities to other players for them to catch up. My number 9 climactic board game of all time, Alhambra. And now we move on to my number 8, and my number 8 is Memoir 44, designed by Richard Borg and published by Days of Wonder Games. And perhaps you can include any of the CNC games, CNC Ancients, Napoleonics, Battle Cry, Battle Lore. All of these games, while they do have the opportunity and the possibility of being lopsided affairs, this, for example, simulates different World War II battles that took place, and one player takes the side of the Axis and the other player takes on the side of the Allies. While there can be some lopsided games because the combat resolution is resolved through dice rolling and a player can have bad luck, quite often you do find very competitive games where players are down to the wire and they both are 1 or 2 points away from victory. And at that point, every roll, every single roll, even if it's not going to defeat a unit, even if it's just going to weaken a unit and lower its forces, every single roll is so crucial and so heart-wrenching that you are so into it. You are so immersed in that moment because you care so much about the outcome of those rolls. Really cool, really fun. My number 8 climactic board game of all time, Memoir 44. Now we move on to my number 7. And my number 7 is Marco Polo, or The Voyages of Marco Polo, designed by Daniel Tascini and Simone Luciani. And this game here is a worker placement, dice placement game based on the travels of Marco Polo along the Silk Road to the lands of China and the southeast of Asia. And basically the board consists of all these different towns or all these different cities that Marco Polo may have traveled through. And players are traveling through these different routes and trying to establish markets in all these locations in order to open up these additional worker placement spots for them. And the worker placement, the dice placement works really cool because the dice, the pips on them, either determine how much times you can trigger a particular action, or they determine how much coin you must pay in order to trigger an already occupied action, an action that's already occupied by another player. So it's really cool to factor all that stuff in. Now, what makes this game climactic is, first of all, the race to the finish to be the player to have the most contracts fulfilled. There is some contract fulfilling going on in this game. You're trying to fulfill different contracts and turn in different resources in order to gain the rewards and the victory points. But at the end of the game, the player who has the most fulfilled contracts is going to get a 7-point bonus. And this game is so well balanced that the basics of the game basically keep the game very close. The game always feels very, very close towards the end as far as points are concerned. So that 7-point difference might make all the difference in the world. Now, even more on top of that, players have these secret hidden objectives. They have these objectives corresponding to the different cities along the map. And basically, if they're able to build a market in each of those cities, they're going to score a certain amount of points. And basically, they could score anywhere from 0 to like 20 points based on their ability to accomplish these objectives. So that's a little bit of hidden information there. And you assume that all the players around the table may or may not accomplish some of those objectives on their objective cards, but what's the chances that they've accomplished them all? And the nail-biting experience of coming to the end, seeing all the players flip over their objective cards, tell you how much they completed and how many points that's going to grant them, tallying up those numbers and seeing who is the winner after all. Really cool, really exciting. I feel like you could apply that to lots of these hidden objective games, but I feel Marco Polo, based on how balanced the game is in its essence and its basic form, combined with the fact of how game altering those objectives can be, I feel like it's the best representation for this type of game on my top climactic list. My number 7 climactic board game of all time, Marco Polo. My number 6 climactic board game of all time is Roombound, designed by Martin Wallace and Daryl Hardy, and this here published by Fantasy Flight Games, and this in particular is the second edition, which is basically the same as the first edition, except you have a D20 or two D10s instead of a D20. This game here, based on the Terranov universe, Fantasy Flight's Terranov universe, and this is the flagship game within that universe, and basically players, anywhere from 2 to 4 players, are taking on the role of a different hero, different adventurer, questing through the lands of Terranov, going through the different cities, shopping for items, for runes, for weapons, for armor, for spells, for different allies even that are going to help them in the aid of combating and fighting against all these different monsters and bad guys. And ultimately, each quest has a overlord or a main bad guy that you're fighting at the end of the game. In this case, you have the High Lord Dragon Margath. And what makes this game climactic is the fact that I play with the Doom variant, which basically means that after a certain amount of cards are played or activated, it triggers the end of the game. So you cannot play endlessly or infinitely until a player chooses to confront the High Lord Margath. No, this serves like a ticking time bomb. This is a little bit of time that the game grants you, a little respite to catch your breath, and also to accrue all the different skills, the weapons, the items, to level up your character, level up their attributes in order to prepare yourself for that tough battle against Margath and all his dragon allies. So it's really, really cool in that regard, as far as giving you that little bit of time, but at the same time holding you accountable so you do not play indefinitely. Now, by the time I make it to fight High Lord Margath, it's always very exciting. I always feel like I have a chance of winning the game. Now, quite often I lose and I fail. I either lose to one of his underlings, or sometimes I make it to High Lord Margath, deal him a little bit of damage. As a matter of fact, the last time I played, I dealt him 6 out of a possible 8 damage, but then I lost the game. But every so often, I pull it off and I'm able to win. So again, that's why this feels like such a climactic game. It just feels like every game feels just right and just tense and exciting enough that even though I don't win, I'm excited and I feel fulfilled for the experience. My number 6 climactic board game of all time, Roombound, 2nd edition in particular. Now we move on to my top 5, the cream of the crop, my 5 favorite or most climactic board games of all time. My number 5 is Thunder Alley by GMT Games here. This is a Jeff and Carla Horger game, and this here is a racing game, a car racing game. And in this game, unlike lots of the other car racing games out there, players do not control one car. They actually control a team of cars in their player color based on the player count. So they can control anywhere from 3 to 5 cars, depending on how many players are playing the game. And there's a bunch of maps. The base game alone comes with 2 double-sided race tracks. So there's 4 different race tracks that players can compete in. And the different race tracks have a certain amount of laps, anywhere from 2 to 4 laps. And after you complete all those laps, you determine a winner. But here's the cool thing about the game. This is what makes it so climactic. First of all, there's that excitement, that rush of wanting to know who's going to cross that threshold, who's going to cross that finish line first. And you find that in lots of other car racing games. However, what's so cool about this game is that because you're scoring points for each of your individual cars within your car team, you're not necessarily going to win the game just because you win the race. Winning the race is going to grant you a good amount of points. However, different things like all the different places that your cars finish in are going to grant you points as well. So perhaps you're better off having 2 or 3 cars that did really well instead of the winner, and perhaps your other cars did not fare so well. Also, you're going to be rewarded for having consistently been in the lead throughout the game. For every round that you end ahead of all the other players in the race, you're going to score 1 point. So that's going to add up at the end of the game. And the player who had the lead for the majority of the game is going to get an additional 1 point at the end of the game as a reward. So even if they didn't win the race, they will be rewarded for having the lead for most of the race. Really cool. You're playing cards that allow you to move different cards in different ways. And they also give you additional abilities, but at the same time, they accrue wear tokens for your different vehicles. Some wear that cannot be removed, that causes permanent damage to your vehicles. Others that can be removed through the use of pit stops. All those pit stops, you wish you could avoid them. But really cool in so many ways. Again, very exciting. And at the end of the game, you're tallying up the points. And again, it's one of those things where, yes, there's always 1 or 2 people that you know clearly had no chance of winning. But those top 2 or 3 players, you're really curious and excited to see after they add up their scores who is the winner. My number 5 climactic board game of all time, Thunder Alley. And now we move on to my number 4. And I've been talking a lot about this game in particular lately. It just seems appropriate for lots of the lists that I've been working on. My number 4 is a Game of Thrones, the board game, designed by Christian Peterson, published by Fantasy Flight Games. And this is based on George R.R. Martin's very popular Game of Thrones universe, A Song of Ice and Fire. And basically, this here takes place, the map is, the board's a map of the lands of Westeros, and all the houses, or 6 of the houses of Westeros, House Martell, Tyrell, Stark, Lannister, Baratheon, and who else? Greyjoy. These are the 6 houses represented in the base game. And they're all competing for the Iron Throne, basically. And you're competing in lots of combat and lots of negotiations taking place, and intrigue and alliances and backstabbing, lots of accruing of different resources, namely power, which is going to be a currency that you use to auction for one of the 3 different tracks in this game. And you got the Iron Throne track, the Fiefdom track, and the Royal Court track. And each of these tracks grant you special priorities based on your ranking on those tracks. But ultimately, you're trying to be the first player who builds or controls 7 castles and or strongholds. Or at the end of 10 rounds, you're trying to be the player who has the most castles and strongholds. And the reason why this game is climactic, I would say, is because by the end of the game, even if it looks like one player has a pretty good lead, because this is a war-based game and there's potentially, 3 to 6 different players competing in this game, especially if you're playing at those high 5 or 6 player counts, the players around the board can do things to mitigate that. They can basically triple team, double team on the lead player, and very likely change the outcome of the game. Now, there will be an element of king making, I guess, when that's concerned, but it doesn't feel wrong in this game because it feels very thematic. Sometimes at this point, you're trying to win over the Iron Throne, and if you're risking that one of your other current allies wins the Iron Throne, so be it, because at least it gives you a chance of hopefully that round winning the game, or at least pushing back the player who's in the lead to maybe buy you more rounds. Really cool, really fun game. Again, that last round always feels exciting. You don't feel like you just want to give up and just end the game. You want to try your best to win over the Iron Throne. My number 4 climactic board game of all time, A Game of Thrones, the board game. My number 3 climactic board game of all time is Legendary Encounters by Upper Deck Entertainment. And this is a game within the Legendary system of games, famous for Marvel and its legendary deck building system. And this here takes place in the Aliens universe, based on these science horror fiction films from the late 70s and 80s. And this game here basically is a deck building game a la Marvel Legendary, but it's not just a copy and paste of that game. Instead, it's its own design, because the player board, or the playmat here, is totally different than the Marvel Legendary one. Here we have it divided into the complex, the combat zone, the operations. And when the enemy cards, or the hive deck cards, are flipped over, they're actually placed into the complex face down. And throughout the game, they're sliding over. And you're using your attack in order to flip those cards over, see what's underneath. And it could be a bad guy, it could be an alien, but it could be something else. It could be a hazard that's detrimental to you. It could be an event that triggers that quite often is very detrimental to you as well. Or it can be one of the items that's required for your particular objective. Each scenario that you play comes with 3 objectives that you're trying to accomplish in order, from 1, 2, and 3 to win the game. And if you don't accomplish all 3 objectives, you're not going to win the game. Now, each player also controls an avatar, which gives them a special ability, or actually one special card that's added to their starting deck. But it also grants them a certain amount of health, a certain amount of life, damage that they could sustain before they are eliminated. And once all the players are eliminated, they have lost the game. Now, it's really cool because as you're accomplishing these objectives and you're getting ready for the next objective, you feel the intensity of the game. The intensity is picking up as the aliens become harder to defeat, as the events and the hazards become more hazardous, and it gets really, really intense. And by the time you make it to the end of the game, you're always feeling the intensity of, is my character going to survive this? Or am I going to be able to accomplish that third objective? And the objectives are so intricate and have to be accomplished in such a particular sense that it feels very thematic from the intellectual property perspective. But again, it adds to that intensity, to that tension that you feel at the end of the game. Am I going to be able, or are we, if you're playing cooperatively, I usually play this game solo, are we going to be able to accomplish this? Will we be able to complete that third objective before all of our life is reduced to zero? Really cool, really exciting. That's why this is my number 3 climactic board game of all time. Legendary Encounters, an alien deck building game. And now we move on to my number 2 climactic board game of all time. And it was really tough between these top 2, but I chose to go with Cosmic Encounter. And this is the science fiction negotiation game par excellence. This game was first designed in the late 70s, 1977, I believe, and has seen multiple iterations through different publishers throughout the decades. And basically each player takes on the role of a different alien race, and there's hundreds of races in the game, and each of these races are very much asymmetric. They grant you a different way of bending, tweaking, or even breaking some of the rules in this game to your favor and to your advantage. Some of these aliens really make players around the table think twice before messing with you. Others really make players or incentivize players to want to align themselves with you. So it's really cool because even the aliens to some extent shape the politics that are taking place in the game. But the player wielding that alien has a lot to do with it. Are they diplomatic enough? Do they have that diplomacy? Are they able to be generous and fair when it's so needed? Are they able to articulate their wishes in a way that does not come across as being forceful, tyrannical, dictator-like? So you have to factor all these things in, the personalities of the people involved, their approach in politics and negotiating, and again, their alien races and their benefits and detriments. And throughout the game, you're partaking in different encounters. An encounter does not necessarily lead to combat, but quite often does. You can choose to negotiate, enter into negotiations with the person you're having an encounter with. However, quite often, sometimes the person will stab you in the back, or perhaps you'll choose to stab them in the back. So again, it's one of those games that involve lots of intrigue, lots of potential alliances, but at the same time, lots of opportunities for betrayal. You have to have a very thick skin and strong heart and not take things personally. Know that it's just a game in order to play this game, because it could get very, very vicious. But at the same time, it plays very quickly because players are just trying to race to have 5 colonies established in systems, planet systems outside of their own. And it's so cool because of the fact that you recruit or invite people to join forces with you. People are all scoring points at the same time. So very often the game has 2, even 3 winners. I haven't seen the game have 4 winners. I think that would be, especially if a 5-player game, it would be very sad to have just 1 loser. I think there was one game that I played that only had one loser, but it's really cool because you're not forced into that situation. If you choose to win with someone else, it's because you actually made that choice to play with someone else. This game, for the most part, feels very exciting and climactic. There are the occasional exceptions to the rule where there are some games that perhaps 2 players are clearly in the lead and you're not so excited about the end. But quite often you have these dynamics, these situations where even the players who are on the lopsided side of defeat are excited and on the edge of their seat, waiting for the outcome of this different encounter, waiting for the revelation of those encounter cards, trying to add up the numbers, seeing they want to throw down reinforcement cards one by one in order to raise up those numbers, see which allies have the most powerful reinforcement cards, and see if any of the relevant alien powers can alter the outcome of that final encounter. Really cool, really exciting. My number 2 climactic board game of all time, Cosmic Encounter. Now, finally, we made it to my number 1. My number 1 climactic board game of all time, and that is Clank, a fantasy deck building adventure. And this game here, one of my favorite deck building games, but this deck building game includes a very tangible spatial element because the board actually consists of a dungeon. that players are maneuvering and traversing through in order to acquire different items, different treasures, different artifacts, in order to engage in combat with different monsters that will grant them gold, to go to the marketplaces and purchase particular things that will help them, like keys and crowns and backpacks, in order to carry more artifacts. But they're playing these, they're maneuvering through this through the use of the deck building, because in this game the deck building has 3 different currencies. You have influence, which you use to purchase more decks, more cards for your deck from the marketplace. You also have swords, which you use to combat against the different monsters, and finally you have boots, which you use to move throughout the different spaces along the board. But you're doing all this in the efforts to accomplish and acquire as much booty or as much loot as possible. But the thing is, some of your cards are negative in the fact that they produce Clank, which represents noise that you're making in this dungeon, which wakes up the dragon. And as you produce more and more Clank, the dragon wakes up. You put all these cubes that correspond to your player color. You pull them out blindly from a bag. And every time you pull a color that matches your player color, you put it on your health track that's on the bottom of the board. And once you're down 10 health, you're eliminated from the game. And that's one of the things that makes this game so exciting, because at the end of the game, you're kind of racing to make it to the top of the castle and get bonus points, be the first player to make it there, and hopefully have the rest of the players not make it out of the dungeon. And it's so neat because even though you're the first player to get out, that does not necessarily guarantee you the win. So you ultimately, even though you were the first player out and probably got lots of money and lots of victory points, you want the other players to die in the dungeon. You don't want them to make it back to the surface level, because if they make it at least to the surface, then they're going to be able to score all the points they earned, and perhaps that will be more points than you. So you got a lot of these interesting situations where you want to see if the player drew enough boot cards to make it to the top, where you trigger a dragon attack and you're pulling out the cubes and you're hoping that they're black neutral cubes that don't affect any of the players, or perhaps you as a player are hoping that some other player's cubes are taken out, or if you feel like the player that's in the lead but still hasn't escaped from the dungeon, you're hoping that that player gets eliminated by the dragon. All these really cool things that leave the game up for grabs until the very, very end. And that's why this is my #1 climactic board game of all time, Clank, a deck building adventure. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here. Please comment down below. Tell me what's your most climactic board game, a board game that you always are satisfied with the way it ends. Tell me what you think about my list. Perhaps there's some games here that you strongly disagree with. Well, that's it for today's video, guys. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.